The air hung heavy, thick with the metallic scent of ozone and the unsettling quiet of a forgotten tomb. Each echoing drip of water from the grimy ceiling of the subway station felt like a hammer blow in the silence. It was past midnight, the last train long gone, leaving only flickering fluorescent lights and an unsettling emptiness. Daniel shivered, pulling his coat tighter against the unnatural chill that permeated the station. He was alone, utterly alone. He checked his watch again, the luminous hands mocking him with their slow, steady progress. The last train had left an hour ago. He was stranded, a prisoner in this concrete and steel purgatory. Doubt gnawed at him. Had he missed a sign, a warning not to linger so late? Now the silence was broken only by the distant rumble of unseen trains, their ghostly echoes a constant reminder of his isolation. He started as a low rumble echoed through the tunnel. A pair of headlights pierced the darkness, growing brighter, closer. Relief, sharp and sudden, washed over him. A train. He was saved. But as the train screamed to a halt, its brakes screeching like a banshee's wail, a new wave of unease washed over him. This train was different. Old. Ancient. Its paint was peeling, its windows clouded and dark, and an unsettling chill emanated from its depths. The train car was empty, or so it seemed at first. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old metal and the distant hum of the city outside. Daniel hesitated, one foot on the platform, the other still planted firmly on the familiar ground of the station. The platform was deserted, the usual hustle and bustle of commuters long gone, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. He should get on, he knew. Any train was better than none at this hour. The last train of the night, it was his only chance to get home. Yet, the emptiness of the carriage seemed to beckon him with a strange, almost malevolent allure. But something held him back, a primal instinct whispering warnings in the back of his mind. It was as if the train itself was alive, breathing, waiting for him to make a move. He stepped inside. The doors hissed shut behind him, the sound final, absolute. It was a sound that seemed to echo through the empty car, reverberating off the walls and amplifying the sense of isolation. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the dust of ages and an underlying scent of decay. It was as if the train had been forgotten by time, left to rot in the shadows. The train lurched forward, throwing Daniel off balance. He stumbled, grabbing for a handrail that felt cold, almost greasy beneath his touch. The sensation sent a shiver down his spine, a physical manifestation of the unease that had settled in his gut. The lights flickered, casting the interior in a sickly yellow glow that did little to penetrate the oppressive gloom. Each flicker seemed to pulse in time with his racing heartbeat, creating a disorienting rhythm that made the shadows dance. He was alone, yet he felt a presence, a weight of unseen eyes upon him. It was as if the train itself was watching, waiting, judging his every move. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. Each thud echoed in his ears, amplifying the sense of dread that had taken hold of him. He scanned the empty seats, their plush velvet upholstery, threadbare and faded, as if worn thin by countless phantom passengers. The seats seemed to hold the weight of untold stories, each one a silent witness to the passage of time. Each dark window seemed to reflect something back at him, fleeting glimpses of movement, of shapes shifting in the darkness, just beyond the edge of his vision. It was as if the train was a portal to another world, a world where shadows came to life. He told himself it was his imagination. The late hour, the unsettling atmosphere of the train, it was playing tricks on his mind, but the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was too strong to ignore, but deep down, a knot of fear tightened in his gut. He was not alone, he could feel it. The train was more than just a means of transportation. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had chosen him as its next passenger. The train rattled onward, its progress strangely smooth, almost gliding, despite the screeching of its wheels against the tracks. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was hypnotic, a relentless beat that seemed to echo the pounding of Daniel's heart. Daniel had long since lost track of time. His watch, a once reliable companion, now seemed to mock him with its unmoving hands. He couldn't remember when he had last seen a familiar landmark or a recognizable station. The stations they passed were unfamiliar, their names mere blurs of faded paint and peeling enamel. Each one seemed more decrepit than the last, as if they had been forgotten by time itself. They were names that didn't exist on any map, names that whispered of forgotten boroughs and abandoned lines. These stations were relics of a bygone era, places that had slipped through the cracks of history. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps this was a service train running on a seldom used track. Maybe it was a route reserved for maintenance or special occasions, a hidden path known only to a select few. Maybe he had simply boarded the wrong train, a simple mistake that would be easily rectified once he reached the next station. He clung to this hope, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. But the logical part of his mind, the part that clung to reason, was drowned out by the rising tide of fear. The fear that he was on a journey with no end, a trip into the unknown. The train didn't stop. It didn't even slow. It barreled forward with a relentless energy, as if driven by some unseen force. It raced on, a steel and iron phantom hurtling through the bowels of the earth. The tunnel walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of light that might have been distant stars, or simply the reflection of his own fear in the glass. Each flicker was a cruel reminder of the world outside, a world that seemed increasingly out of reach. He was lost, he realized, truly lost. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless and disoriented. This was not a journey he could simply disembark from at the next stop. The stations were dark and empty, mere shadows of their former selves. This train, this track, it was taking him somewhere else, somewhere he didn't want to go. The destination was a mystery, but the sense of dread was palpable. The air grew colder, the metallic tang replaced by a cloying, earthy scent. It was a smell that spoke of decay and neglect, of things long forgotten. It smelled of graves, of things long buried and best left undisturbed. The scent was suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the smell, the oppressive atmosphere, the growing certainty that he had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The train's relentless motion seemed to mock his attempts at denial, each jolt a reminder of his inescapable fate. A sound, a low murmur, barely audible at first, then growing steadily louder. It was as if the darkness itself was whispering secrets, secrets that were never meant to be heard by human ears. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He was no longer alone. The oppressive silence of the train car was shattered by the eerie murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. Across from him, shrouded in the shadows of the train car, figures began to emerge. They seemed to materialize from the very darkness itself, as if the shadows had taken form. They were humanoid in form, but their movements were jerky, unnatural. It was as if they were marionettes, controlled by an unseen puppeteer with frayed strings. Their skin, what he could see of it beneath their tattered clothing, was deathly pale, stretched taut over bone. They looked like they had been drained of life, mere husks of what they once were. He shrank back, his breath catching in his throat. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on him. They didn't seem to notice him at first, their attention focused on one another, their voices a low, guttural rasp that set his teeth on edge. It was a language he couldn't understand, but the malice in their tone was unmistakable. He couldn't understand their words, but their tone was unmistakable, accusatory, angry. It was as if they were arguing over something of great importance, something that had gone terribly wrong. One of the figures turned its head, its eyes two black pits in the pallid landscape of its face, locking onto his. The intensity of its gaze was like a physical force, pinning him in place. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, a cold so profound it felt like a physical touch. It was as if icy fingers were trailing down his back, leaving a trail of fear in their wake. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there under the weight of that unwavering stare. His mind screamed at him to move, but his body was paralyzed with fear, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in place, a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator. Every muscle in his body was locked in place, as if he had been turned to stone. The figure rose, its movement stiff and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by fraying strings. Each motion was deliberate yet disjointed, as if it was struggling against invisible bonds. It took a step towards him, then another. Each step was accompanied by a creak, like old wood bending under pressure. The other figures continued their hushed conversation, oblivious to the exchange taking place just feet away. Their murmurs filled the air, a constant, unsettling background noise. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic tattoo against his ribs. Each beat was a reminder of his own vulnerability, his own mortality. He was trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The walls of the train car seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing in from all sides.